I've come here today to an RAF base, or is it an American base, at Fairford in Gloucestershire, dressed as a Welsh Weapons Inspector to inspect what weapons of mass destruction they're planning to drop on Iraq. The press recently reported this is the most complex, largest, most expensive operation ever undertaken by Gloucestershire Constabulary. They reckon that it's going to cost the British taxpayer £7 million just to police this base. And there's 1,000 police here, which seems rather over the top considering that this is a peaceful demonstration by ordinary people who are protesting against this imminent war against Iraq.
You stand over here, please, sir. Section 44 of the Terrorism Act.
I've just been stopped under the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2000 for some unknown reason to me. I'm not a terrorist, they're the terrorists over there. During the early hours of March the 20th, 2003, the B-52 bombers took off from Fairford for their 5-hour flight to Iraq. In the words of the Pentagon, to shatter Iraq physically, emotionally and psychologically, a policy known as shock and awe.
After another night of US and British air assault on Baghdad, the city's Al-Kindi teaching hospital received some 120 civilian patients. 10 were dead upon arrival. A patient said they have been attacked by cluster bombs.
Among other ordnance dropped on Iraq, that's what they were dropping from Fairford, cluster bombs, which are actually released landmines. Their effects are indiscriminate. They don't routinely explode on impact, but can remain to exact a deadly toll for years to come, especially on children, who easily mistake the half-buried yellow cylinders for a toy or a ball. I don't think we'll ever make the world a secure place by spending billions of pounds on heinous weapon systems like cluster bombs. I've been thinking, if I was to give money to a terrorist organisation, then that would be construed as an act of terrorism. If I paid money to a contract killer or an assassin, that in law would be an act of murder. When I pay my taxes to the armed forces, then I'm morally accountable for all of their activities and all of the results. It's being estimated that the war against Iraq is going to cost 3, 4, 5, maybe £6 billion. The Treasury's been pretty cagey about figures. And this is the same Treasury, incidentally, that spends every year 20 times more on military expenditure than it spends on the environment, and spends 10 times more every year on the military than it does on international development. They say they want to make poverty history or fight global warming. Well, I just don't get it, really. The war's been going on for 3 weeks now, and it's not looking good. There's been reports of terrible civilian casualties, and one story particularly has moved me. It's the story of a 12-year-old, Ali Ismail Abbas, who's lost his whole family and both his arms when a missile hit his home about 3 nights ago. No, I don't want to be made complicit in this. I'm going to bite the bullet. I've got an end-of-year tax bill, and I'm writing to the Inland Revenue asking that 10% of my income tax allocated to military expenditure be redirected to peaceful purposes instead. For instance, the Department of International Development. I believe that in the case of war and deliberate killing, that I have a right to determine how my taxes are spent, and by withholding 10% of my taxes, I'm exercising that right. My local MP opposed the war and also happens to be a Shadow Defence Secretary, so I'm meeting him to see what he thinks about my decision to withhold taxes.
Well, I think it's a great idea that you could sort of somehow withdraw your taxes from paying for something or other, but the practicalities of that and the reality of that, frankly, I can't really see how that would work. People, for example, who have children, well, they would say, well, I'm sorry, I don't want my taxes to go to pay for state education. People perhaps who are fit and healthy would say, well, I don't want my taxes to go and pay towards the health service. People perhaps who have their own private retirement income would say, well, I don't want to pay national insurance because I've got my own money set aside for my retirement. Why should I pay for the state pension? I think the reality is, if you live in a democratic, civilized society, which despite everything I think Britain is, then I think you accept that as part of that, you make your taxes and you pay your contribution. And if the people don't like that, then they must consider whether they want to stay in this country or not.
But I think that paying taxes for pensions, schools and hospitals is very different from paying taxes towards the military. Pensions, school and hospital budgets don't go towards deliberate killing. Military budgets do. And for this reason I continue withholding my taxes, and I'm summoned to appear in court.
On 104, 104.6 and 94.7 FM, BBC Hereford and Worcester News.
And so at 5 o'clock on Friday the 29th of August, Bethan Bell has tonight's main stories.
An author who's refusing to pay part of his income tax because he disagrees with the war in Iraq has had his case thrown out by a judge. If he continues to refuse to pay, he could end up in jail.
Despite talk of imprisonment, I've decided to carry on withholding my £750. And so the judge apparently has issued a warrant for bailiffs to seize my goods. So my family and I waited for the bailiffs to come. For 3 months we waited. They finally turned up on my first day at a new teaching job in Hereford. It was disarming and disquieting to think that someone had been watching so that they could arrange for bailiffs to come the first day they definitely knew I wouldn't be there. My mobile phone went off, second lesson in the morning, and it was my wife saying that there were 2 bailiffs at our door with a warrant. I couldn't leave my class, and anyway my work's 8 miles away by bus. So I phoned the bailiffs, who told me that unless I gave them my credit card details, they were going to take our car away. They said that their visit alone was going to cost £600, and so on top of court costs, fines and interest, my original sum withheld of £750 had now become a bill of over £1,700. I've got a young family to support, and I decided I had no option but to pay up. So I suppose I've been conscripted into this war like the rest of the British taxpayers. It's a difficult process doing something like this on your own, and I do feel I need some solidarity, really. You've been quite vociferous about this war against Iraq, and I just wonder if millions who've marched and thousands signed petitions and all the rest of it, that at the end of the day we've all, as taxpayers, had to actually pay for the war, so in a sense we've all become financial conscripts. Do you feel
I've always felt, that somehow we can't ever find enough money to feed our kids, look after our elderly, better our schools, but we can always magically come up with billions of pounds to fight a war.
It's a very good argument to raise, because it forces people to confront the reality that they're funding these crimes, that however much we say not in our name, It is, in fact, being done in our name, and certainly our money is making it possible.
We are all implicated in this. We all have blood on our hands because those of us who are taxpayers have paid for it. I have paid for the war in Iraq, you have paid for the war, well maybe you haven't, but the great majority of people in this country have paid for the war in Iraq, whether we want to or not, and therefore we are morally implicated, we are morally responsible for what went on.
Well, there is an interesting history, which I think goes back to Thoreau in the last century, and more recently Joan Bowes, who have refused to pay their taxes because they profoundly and fundamentally disagreed with wars that their own governments were fighting. I think that's a very honourable form of statement of citizen independence, their right for their taxes to be used in a way which they approve of when we're talking about war and peace.
It's interesting to learn that there is a historical tradition of war tax resistance, particularly in the United States, and I'd like to discover more. So I've arranged to meet Anthony Osborne, a historian who lectures in American Studies.
In the 17th and 18th century, Quakers refused to contribute taxes towards the colonial military campaigns. And in 1846, the Quakers again refused to pay their taxes. And it was the Mexican War which led the writer Thoreau to also refuse to pay his taxes, an action which subsequently resulted in his imprisonment. In the end, somebody paid the taxes for him, and so his protest ended abruptly. But not ending his opposition there, he decided to commit his feelings in writing and published the pamphlet on the duty of civil disobedience in 1849. And it was this pamphlet which was to inspire the likes of Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, and the civil rights movement a century later.
Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first, and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law, so much as for the right.
In the century after Thoreau's protest, wars began to be fought on an industrial scale, the hallmarks of conflict becoming total war involving whole societies and world war spanning the surface of the globe. In the First World War, over 9,700,000 troops lost their lives, including 885,000 troops from Britain. Every family, including my own, ravaged by war. During the first 14 days of the war, 20,000 British troops lost their lives. And as the horrors of modern warfare began to invade public consciousness, the flood of volunteers was soon reduced to a trickle. Compulsory call-up, conscription became inevitable. And in 1916, the Military Service Act was passed, making military service for all able-bodied single men compulsory. Within the Act was a conscience clause giving those who objected to deliberate killing exemption from military service. 16,000 conscientious objectors claimed the right to refuse to kill, and while 1,300 were sent to prison, most were assigned non-combatant duties, such as working with ambulance units as medics or as stretcher bearers. British conscription ended in 1919, but resumed 20 years later as World War II broke out, when 60,000 objectors claimed the right to be exempted from military service. While most conscientious objectors again worked in non-combatant roles, some became guinea pigs in medical experiments. But it was the Cold War that brought conscientious objection to paying for war back towards the limelight. As the Soviet Union and the United States of America acquired enormous arsenals of weapons of mass destruction, the nature of military confrontation changed. Rather than tackle each other head-on, superpower governments fought indirectly in so-called proxy wars with devastating effects. This was nowhere more apparent than during the Vietnam War, which provoked widespread opposition in the United States and around the world. In 1964, the singer Joan Baez withheld a portion of her taxes in protest at the war. She was followed by the academic Noam Chomsky, the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and the Nobel Prize winner for medicine Albert Ghiocchi, motivating 20,000 other citizens to withhold their taxes. And as the Vietnam War ended in 1975, the modern war tax resistance movement was born. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, the Cold War intensified.
Let us bear that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Global military spending reached new heights despite widespread public alarm about the spread of nuclear weapons.
I'm going to drop a 20-megaton bomb right on this great lawn as ground zero. It would vaporize every person out to a radius of 6 miles from here and destroy every building.
As states increasingly acquired high-tech and sophisticated weapon systems with awesome destructive power, mass physical conscription became a thing of the past. Conscientious objectors began to assert that financial conscription had replaced physical conscription, a position unconsciously affirmed by the United States Secretary of State Alexander Haig in 1982.
Let them march all they want as long as they continue to pay their taxes.
In the mid-1980s, as American intercontinental cruise missiles were deployed on British soil, some British citizens began to refuse to pay their taxes towards nuclear weapons, and in 1986, for the first time since physical conscription had ended, a conscientious objector was sent to prison.
Well, I have such strong conscientious objections to paying for these, particularly for these weapons of mass destruction.
In the 1990s, others were sent to prison for refusing to pay for a new kind of war. The American and British aerial assault on Iraq, beginning mid-January 1991, was the most intensive in history. 110,000 aerial sorties, 88,000 tons of bombs, the equivalent of 7.5 Hiroshimas, unleashed in just 42 days. During the First Gulf War, 16 British military personnel and 158 Americans lost their lives. Between 30,000 and 150,000 Iraqis lost theirs. The nature of warfare had changed completely. At the beginning of the 20th century, 80% of war fatalities were combatants. But by the end of the century, 80% of war fatalities were civilians. And things weren't going to get any better.
What do you think about people like myself who refuse to fund war by paying the 10% of their taxes that go towards military expenditure?
I think they're right, because we need people to stand up for this kind of thing, like in Iraq. Often what's happened, we just obey and say nothing, but I think we need more people like you.
it's not a good idea, because we elect our government democratically, and then that's the official process, and you can't just object on anything you want, because then you could get people objecting on more and more minor issues, and the whole thing would just get out of control with people doing whatever they want.
No, I think military expenditure is an expensive thing. War's an expensive game. If we've got to pay it, then we all should pay it at the end of the day. Yeah.
They still live in a country that's being defended by the armed forces, and if we were invaded or something, they'd probably start complaining about why there's no army, and they should have to pay for it.
I don't think it's sufficient to say I'm against it to withhold taxes, so I'm not in favour of withholding taxes. I am, however, in favour of conscientious objectors making their views well known to everyone, so we can try and reduce the levels of violence in modern society.